Tony Abbott is now being described as a misogynist and a man who may be a racist and a man who should not be involved with this government in any way, shape or form. Not just by some Guardian reading liberal columnist, this indeed by the First Minister of Scotland. Let's talk to Helen Dale, our favourite Australian on this show, to find out what is going on. Helen, a very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike. How are you?
Well, listen, I'm slightly upset about the sort of the stuff that's being thrown at Tony Abbott. I mean, he's a very senior politician. He was a man, as you've described, before Nigel Farage did, who sorted the illegal migrant business in Australia. The fact that we've now got him on our team negotiating with Brussels, I would think is a pretty good thing, isn't it?
Well, Tony Abbott is an intensely polarising figure in Australia. So 2 things to keep in mind. 1, any former Australian Prime Minister, regardless of political stripe, would be an excellent trade envoy. No. Australia has decades of experience as being an open, outward-facing, free trade affirming country. It is very good at its civil service is historically very good at negotiating trade deals. They do them quickly, they do them effectively. Australians are very, very, very good at this. And any Australian ex-PM, going right back to the oldest 2 of them, which are John Howard and Paul Keating, they're both still alive, would be absolutely fine. The only downer for those 2 men would be the fact that they're both quite elderly because they were Prime Minister a long time ago. Abbott's still relatively young, as is Gillard, as is Rudd. All of those people would actually be very good at trade. You could pick any former Australian Prime Minister. Rudd maybe less so.
Was he the one he was the one that burst into tears famously, wasn't he?
Yeah, not only that, despite the fact that Kevin Rudd had a background as a diplomat and was considered to be very clever and very thoughtful. He spoke fluent Mandarin. I mean, he actually had his own nickname in Mandarin that Chinese people would give him. Right. His Mandarin was so perfect. You know, people would get into telephone conversations in Mandarin with Kevin Rudd, and they just think he came from a different part of China. His accent was so good. So he was very clever, but he had a personality flaw that became apparent when he was Prime Minister that's far more serious than any of the flaws that Abbott or Gillard or Morrison or Turnbull had, which is basically he would lose his rag at people who disagreed with him on a trade issue.
Right.
And he notoriously, at the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009, he had a disagreement with a Chinese figure, a Chinese civil servant, and he then went away and didn't realise that the Chinese man understood some English, and he talked in extremely disparaging terms about the Chinese delegation, including a swear word that I can't use now because it's before the watershed, where he basically said the Chinese are trying to rat F us. The Chinese are rat effers.
Right.
And so
not very diplomatic then, really, is he?
No, you don't want that sort of figure being a trade envoy.
Right.
And one of the things that became very clear when Australia turned into what I called in my Standpoint article that I tweeted out, which I wrote last year on this situation, when Australia became Italy with crocodiles, where we went through 6 prime ministers in 8 years, if you count Kevin Rudd twice, because he came back again. One of the things that became clear was that the 2 that were publicly popular, which was Malcolm Turnbull and Kevin Rudd, and this is independent of politics, Turnbull was coalition, Liberal National, right-leaning, Rudd was Labour, centre-left, was that the ones that were popular with the public were awful to their staff and dreadful to deal with. Whereas the ones that were less popular with the public, which was Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard, and once again, different sides of politics. Tony Abbott was coalition, Julia Gillard was Labour. They were the ones who were adored by their staff, who were seen to be very easy to work with and who were good at trade negotiation. They were both good at this. And in fact, Julia Gillard was generally good. This was when I was working for a parliamentarian at the time. Julia Gillard was generally just very good at negotiating with people, full stop. She was a very personable figure. But in public, she was like Theresa May in 2017, gave these dreadful wooden set point speeches that were completely unpersuasive. So Tony Abbott will be fine as his trade job, and it is legitimate and fair to call any senior Australian political or civil service figure hired with that background in mind an expert. Australia's good at this, much better than Britain, much better than the EU.
Right.
That's a simple thing.
But yet, here we have a senior figure politically in this country, Nicola Sturgeon, saying that she wouldn't have him anywhere near any government negotiating process and doesn't think that he should be being used.
That is a reflection of the election campaign which was fought between Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard. The Abbott was an extraordinarily effective opposition leader. Like, the coalition had been absolutely slaughtered in 2007 when Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister. They should have been out of power for a decade. Rudd was so incompetent he was removed by his own party, and Gillard was put in his place. She was much more competent, but had this Theresa May style wooden presence that just didn't cut it through to the Australian people. Abbott was this live wire and a good public speaker and funny and just seemed to sort of have more of a mojo. But the way he ran his campaign, it was relentlessly negative. And when he won in 2013, and he did indeed win, he then brought this negativity to his style of governance. And I mean, in this period, that was 2013 was when the politician I was working for, David Lionhelm, was first elected. And David made the comment when we were constantly, because David was a crossbencher in the Senate, and so therefore had to be negotiated with when the government wanted to get bills through the upper house. Remember, Australia, the two chambers are equal in power, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And I remember David saying to me, we were sitting in David's office in Canberra, and David said, it's like anti-communication. All he can do is campaign. He can't actually govern. And one aspect of this was his behaviour in the chamber, in the House of Representatives. And there was a very famous incident where he and Gillard had a roaring ding-dong row, and you can find it on YouTube. Watch the full-length version where you've got both Abbott and Gillard going for it, hammer and tongs. You will be appalled and horrified by this, because the Australian House of Representatives and even the Senate, and I've watched Senate Question Time as well in Australia many times because I worked for a senator, makes PMQs here look like a very sedate little garden teapot.
Well, do you know, it's interesting what you say about Tony Abbott, because Boris Johnson is now being accused of exactly the same thing, that he was great at campaigning, fantastically campaigned twice and won the election to become Mayor of London, won Prime Minister with 80-seat majority, but governing is a very different kettle of fish.
Yes, I mean, all governments learn this, and I say this in my Standpoint piece, which I tweeted out and which you've retweeted. Governing is harder than opposing.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason Keir Starmer is doing so well is purely because he's not Jeremy Corbyn, and he's the leader of the opposition, and he's smart enough to be able to ask good questions. But if the boot were on the other foot, he would be in exactly the same level of mess.
Yes, of course.
Governing is much harder than just opposing or leading the opposition. And if you're very bad at it, like Jeremy Corbyn, then you do come unstuck. But Starmer is obviously an order of magnitude more able than Jeremy Corbyn was. That's simply obvious from his
Jeremy
behaviour.
Corbyn has now lost the plot to such an extent that he actually put out a video yesterday
because he won a Twitter poll.
Thanking people who voted him on a Twitter poll as the best Prime Minister we never had. I mean, how deluded do you have to be to do that?
I know, it's just very, very... I saw a joke. I think it was Jeff Norcott or Konstantin Kizin about winning in a Twitter poll.
Yeah.
Thinking that it's politically relevant is like thinking that monopoly money is relevant to your credit rating. And I have to say I saw that and I absolutely snorted and had a cup of tea in my hand.
Yes,
well,
absolutely.
That's very funny. Well done.
Well done. Yeah, absolutely right. But I mean, as far as the Tony Abbott kind of misogyny accusations are. Is it from that speech?
It's from that speech. Basically, what had happened was the Speaker of the House in Australia is not impartial in the same way that the Speaker is here. Like
didn't used to be here either.
And so what happened? So Australia follows the elder tradition. Now, the Speaker is meant to be impartial once they sit in the chair,
right.
And most of the time they are, but they are still a normal MP with a normal constituency that they have to win at election time against other parties. And if they lose their seat, a new Speaker will have to be elected. So it's quite different.
Right.
And anyway, there was a bit of a dry run at trying to have an independent Speaker in Australia. And the chap who was chosen was a guy called Peter Slipper. And he was more the Burko or the current Hugh, the current chap, yeah, the idea of an independent speaker. He was an independent. He sat in the House as an independent rather than one of the other parties. And anyway, a sexual innuendo about Peter Slipper became known. And it was a relatively serious one for the simple reason that in Australia there is an omerta on reporting on politicians and senior journalists' sexual peccadillos.
Yes.
It's only if they're exposed as hypocrites are they reported on by the press. And Slipper was exposed as a hypocrite. He had been very opposed to homosexuality. He'd been very anti-gay rights. And it had turned out he had made homosexual advances on his staff.
Right.
And anyway, Labor
it's amazing, isn't it, how many times that is the case with some politicians?
Oh well, yes. This is the Christopher Hitchens point, and it's the point that Ed West made in his book we were talking about last week. If you're a social conservative and you're caught as a hypocrite, it's just fatal. But it's also, if you're an environmentalist and you're flying first class everywhere to go to Extinction Rebellion protests, it's also just fatal, and it's the same thing. But anyway, there was an argument over Slipper because it was Gillard's government that had appointed him Speaker, and it was supposedly a campaigning Labor government, and Julia Gillard was Australia's first woman Prime Minister. Yeah. And so Tony Abbott got stuck into her for, why are you appointing this horrible person who's a horrible, sleazy, sexist, awful human being, which he was. So what you've got then is... something just popped up on the screen there. But so then Julia Gillard got very cranky about being lectured, and she got up and she said, I will not be lectured by this man about sexism, basically. And it was a very, very powerful speech, and it referred back to the way Tony Abbott treated her in the chamber, and also when he campaigned against her. And this was extended to aspects of his general social views. The Abbott family is a very strange family in the context of conservatism in Australia, because Tony Abbott's background is as a conservative Catholic, and traditionally in Australia, Catholics vote for the Labor Party. Now, so this is just one of the peculiarities of Australian history. But Tony Abbott had finished up in the coalition rather than in the Labor Party. Originally, going back years, the Labor Party had courted him. He was a very talented man. He was a very fine athlete. He went to Oxford. He was a Rhodes Scholar, although admittedly he was chosen the two big scholarships, Rhodes and Clarendon. I was a Clarendon Scholar, so I've got some awareness of how they work. Right. They require you to be an all-rounder. So you need to be clever, but you also need to be good at sport as well. Right. But there tends to be with the Rhodes Scholarships, often they'll go more one or more the other, depending on the year. And so Tony Abbott was more of a sportsman. So he was a double blue in boxing while he was at Oxford. He later became a competitive triathlete, a super athlete. You would never guess his age because he plays so much sport and he rides for miles, and he does volunteer surf lifesaving, which is a big deal in Australia because the seas are dangerous. Yeah. And the surf is big, anyone who's travelled there. So he was more the sporty kind of Rhodes Scholar. And interestingly, the huge fight that he got into with Malcolm Turnbull, who I was actually in Canberra in Senator Lionhelm's office in the Australian Parliament House when Malcolm Turnbull spilt Abbott. That's what Australians call it when there's a turnover of the leadership within a political party, like what happened with, say, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. That's called a leadership spill. And I was actually in the Parliament. We were all watching as the votes were counted in the parliamentary coalition, what is called the party room in Australia. And then Abbott was defeated by Malcolm Turnbull, and we were all standing there watching it. And then they all came out and gave their speeches in the forecourt in Parliament House, and Abbott conceded and Turnbull had won and all of that kind of thing. And Abbott was a Rhodes Scholar, Turnbull was a Rhodes Scholar, but Turnbull was one of the ones that wasn't a sporty Rhodes Scholar, or not very sporty. He was very intellectual. And if British people have heard of Malcolm Turnbull, it's to do with Spycatcher. He was the one that busted the Spycatcher case open, so that Peter Wright's book had to be published, basically, and because it was being published in Commonwealth countries, and Turnbull was the lead counsel on that case. Very, very fine barrister before he went into Parliament. Enormously successful businessman, multi-millionaire. He donated his entire salary, prime ministerial salary, to charity every year, because it was literally the kind of change that you and I would lose down the back of the sofa to him.
Right,
So
absolutely right. And whatever happened to Julia?
the-
Whatever happened to Julia Gillard after all this?
Well, she very sensibly, and unlike Kevin Rudd, I have to say, just quietly stepped back from politics.
Right.
And behaved in a much more mature and sensible way. Turnbull and Rudd are the two who've carried on like two bob watches, one from each side of the aisle.
Yeah.
And until now, Abbott has been fairly quiet as well. He sort of stepped back from it also. So the personalities continued to persist. But the point is, you had this extraordinary polarizing period in Australian democracy. 6 prime ministers in 8 years, if you count Kevin Rudd twice. You know, and the
yes, it was. It wasn't amazing. It wasn't. I remember it being an incredible time. How will Abbott react? Do you think to being labelled as a misogynist in this country? Will he care?
He's been called this all his time in Australian politics, and I honestly think it's water off a duck's back to him. If I were to reassure, I mean, I'm gay myself. If I were to reassure gay people in this country, because it's mainly about same-sex marriage that is the issue, is that he's not being asked to address social issues. I would be more concerned if someone were going to put him in charge of, say, family policy or that kind of thing. Because when he tried to come up with ideas about, you know, sort of maternity leave and whatnot, they were always, in Australia, they were always incredibly cack-handed and not properly costed and that kind of thing.
No, we don't. We've got Harry and Meghan for family policy now in this country, so we don't have to worry too much about anything else.
But
so
if he's doing trade, he'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to
it.
At that. But also, he sounds like a character, and he sounds like a guy that would be welcome in our rather sort of wishy-washy world at the moment of politics.
He's very good on charitable stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, if he finishes up with any role in charitable organisations, particularly for disadvantaged kids. He had a great reputation in Australia for helping disadvantaged Aboriginal kids.
Yeah.
So if you get him involved in the charitable sector, I mean, he's one of those people who rattles the surf lifesavers bucket and can just talk you into putting money in it.
Right. Well, listen, it's a very welcome addition, as far as I'm concerned, to the political discourse that we're having. Let's finish up, before we go, Helen, just on Adele. Let's talk about the ridiculousness of that accusation that was made about her somehow culturally misappropriating black culture because she had her hair put into ringlets and
wore a Jamaican
bikini. Yeah, I mean,
have to say, I
really
was delighted. I was delighted, with relatively few exceptions, the response of Britons of Jamaican heritage, and broadly speaking of West Indian heritage, was just beautiful. I mean, you might disagree with David Lammy, but the way he popped at the tweet and goes, "Good on you, Adele. Ignore the haters from across the pond."
Right. Well, he might be stupid, David Lammy, but he's not that stupid. He doesn't want to upset the people in his constituency who like Adele. I know.
What it showed is that the difference in history between race relations in the United States and the United Kingdom is just extraordinary. And just watching all these black British people going, "Americans, go away. No, we're not talking down to you because of your skin colour, because we're black too. We're talking to you like this because you're Americans and you need to stop telling other countries how to run their domestic policy."
Yeah, also, I think the problem for a lot of, I think, black American activists is they don't really get people who aren't white in this country, and they don't really get the multiculturalism of this country, because America's not like that. America is a very segregated society and continues to be so.
Every time I go to the United States, I notice this, and I have to say my partner had some experience of this, with a situation where seeing a perfectly nice area with a view to purchasing a house, and was told, "Oh no, you don't want to live there. Perfectly good area, lovely suburban homes, you know, this kind of thing." This is going back maybe about 10 years ago. And then found out after a lot of very detailed research that that was a middle-class black area and it wasn't appropriate for a white British engineer to move into that area.
Yeah.
And this is long after redlining or anything like that. It's just, you know, people being shepherded. And this is annoying.
Well, it's exactly right.
It's very, and it just doesn't happen here.
No, of course not. But that's the way America is set up, and that's unfortunately why they're having so many problems at the moment. Helen, great to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed. Helen Dale reporting into us on why Tony Abbott seems to rub so many people up the wrong way.